Alive and Well STL is a presentation of the St. Louis Regional Health Commission and RareGem Productions to build a healthier St. Louis. Power up with the positive. Learn more at OneRareGem.com. That's OneRaregem.com.
Support for Alive and Well STL comes from Beyond Housing, helps entire communities become better places to live. Learn more at beyondhousing.org.
The Regional Health Commission works in partnership with regional health sector advocates and stakeholders to improve healthcare access, reduce health disparities, and improve health outcomes for the uninsured and the underinsured in St. Louis City and County.
Alive and Well STL with Bethany Johnson-Javois, CEO of the St. Louis Integrated Health Network and Managing Director of the Ferguson Commission.
St. Louis is home to a variety of cultures, races, and ethnicities. With this diversity comes global ideas, perspectives, and productive contributions to all of our lives. While trauma and toxic stress affects nearly everyone and their health, our community is seeing the growing effects of racism on their mental health.
And I think it's really important to problematize the idea of color blindness, because people often say, well, that's the goal if we would just get beyond race and not see it. And I would like to remind people that Dr. King said that he wanted people to be judged not by the color of their skin, right? By the content of their character, not the color of their skin, not to not see it. Mm-hmm. And so it's important to see it because it's part of how people see their lives. It's a part of, unfortunately, how we've constructed access and opportunity. So we can't be blind to it, judge people based on it. But I think for St. Louis to embrace the reality of our history and the reality of our restrictive covenants and the way that that shaped our homes and our schools requires us to see race, but then not continue to use it as a defining factor.
We'll be right back.
Shh, quiet down, man. What they saying? What they talking about?
Yeah, not only does trauma and toxic stress affect us physically, it affects the choices we make, and it affects the opportunities that we have. If I grew up in Spanish Lake, the opportunities and choices I would have would be much different from Afton and Sunset Hills. We need to keep in mind that communities under stress and under constant trauma, the choices and opportunities differ.
Oh, yo, you gotta be kidding me. All this time we've been thinking something was wrong with us, and everybody looking at us like we just turning up for nothing. No wonder cats is all wound up, worked up, and upset. It's mad stressful out here, and it's making us sick. It's time to thrive.
We have to recognize the true cause, the root of what's wrong with somebody. Working not to address the symptoms, but to address the cause. It's time to thrive. Be alive and well.
I think what's important is for us to be willing to understand what has happened to people. So instead of what's wrong with that girl, it's what happened to that girl.
Join this movement at aliveandwellstl.com.
So could you tell me a little bit in terms of your introduction? What is your definition of a St. Louis that is alive and well?
So when I think of a St. Louis that's alive and well, I think of a St. Louis that sees the humanity in everyone and is able to not only see the humanity in everyone, but foster potential so that everyone can reach their full potential. And that means opening barriers in terms of education, healthcare, improving our interethnic relations. But when I think of alive and well, I think of fullness and full potential.
Alive and Well, STL.
Hello, and thank you for joining us again today. I am Bethany Johnson-Javois, host of Alive and Well STL and Managing Director of the Ferguson Commission. Today, we are joined in the studio by Dr. Kira Banks, Assistant Professor of Psychology at St. Louis University. Thank you for joining, Kira.
Thanks for having me.
As we talk and think about what it means for our community to be alive and well, I am very excited to be speaking with Dr. Banks. St. Louis is home to a variety of cultures, races, and ethnicities. The contributions of minorities, or what my friend likes to call people of the global majority, like those of all St. Louisans, rests on a foundation of mental health and wellness. Mental health is fundamental to our overall health and productivity. It is the basis for successful contributions to family, community, and to our society. So, Dr. Banks, thank you for being here to discuss with us this very important and I think underexplored topic. Let me jump in with this question. Does seeing humanity mean looking beyond skin color and to be colorblind and to not see color?
No. And I think it's really important to problematize the idea of color blindness because people often say, well, that's the goal if we would just get beyond race and not see it. And I would like to remind people that Dr. King said that he wanted people to be judged not by the color of their skin, right? By the content of their character, not the color of their skin, not to not see it. And so it's important to see it because it's part of how people see their lives. It's a part of, unfortunately, how we've constructed access and opportunity. So we can't be blind to it, judge people based on it. But I think for St. Louis to embrace the reality of our history and the reality of our restrictive covenants and the way that that shaped our homes and our schools requires us to see race, but then not continue to use it as a defining factor.
Absolutely. And I think I want people to be able to see all of me. And that includes what you're seeing on the outside in addition to what you're seeing on the inside. That's a good balance. So, Dr. Banks, tell us a little bit about your work. What is the body of your work and how did you get into it?
So my work examines how discrimination impacts mental health. So I was very interested in how people cope with, understand, perceive discrimination and to what extent it impacts their mental health. Because if all people who are discriminated against had negative mental health, we would have women, people of color, people of disadvantaged targeted groups with extremely high levels of mental health compared to privileged groups or advantaged groups. And we actually don't see that. There is some mixed literature that in certain populations you might see African Americans experiencing higher levels of depressive symptoms or Latinos experiencing higher numbers of anxiety symptoms. But on the whole, it suggests that there are other variables impacting the experience of discrimination. So my research is really trying to understand, I think, two things. One, how can we dismantle racism? But two, in the meantime, how can we help people who are experiencing it cope with it and avoid the negative effects?
So let's start with this. What are the effects of racism on the privileged populations?
So there's literature on the psychosocial costs of racism to whites. So in thinking about racism in particular, that racism affects whites in all sorts of ways. And some of the main areas are the experience of white guilt, the experience of fear, right? And so those are two main constructs that the literature focuses on. And we don't often, and then the loss of even their own identity and what it means to be connected with their full identity and not just whiteness as a construct of privilege. So I think it's important to realize there was research actually after Hurricane Katrina that whites who experienced the greatest or the worst mental health outcomes, so the greatest number of negative mental health effects, were those who had the highest level of white guilt. So it was the relationship between being white and perceiving racism actually was worse on your mental health if you had high levels of white guilt. And to me, what that suggests is that we have to understand and acknowledge and name the experience of white folks as well in race and ethnic relations and encourage them not to stay stuck in the guilt and shame because it actually doesn't help.
How would one get unstuck if that's the place that they were in?
I think understanding the different dynamics around race and racism. So as a white person, if you are experiencing a lot of guilt, it's important to, of course, be accountable for your actions, right? I'm not trying to let people off the hook, but also understand that some of this is about systems and institutions and that you can, in your position of power and privilege, often you're in a position to affect those institutions and practices. So sometimes understanding the history of how we got to be this way without loading that on to your sense of shame and guilt, right? We just have to be honest about what happened and then looking for opportunities where your privilege allows you to affect change, right? So being a change agent rather than helpless in this guilt-ridden state when it's not helpful for you and it's also not helpful for change.
I thought about another area in which I could see for the privileged populations that there's a miss in relationships. There's some regret with unformed relationships. I had a best friend when I was in second grade, and I didn't understand then why we were no longer friends. It was really braided around class and race, and her family did not want her to associate with me. When we graduated from high school and came back for our 10 to 20 year reunion, she said to me, I regret the fact that we would have been best friends to this day. You probably would have been family, but for race, now I understand that I missed a whole lifetime of relationships. So I just wonder how many other people think about the regret of not having exposure to culture, to people, to human beings with different experiences. And the loss for that is quite traumatic.
It is. And not everyone recognizes that. But for those who do, I also have gotten, those Facebook messages from people from high school who say, oh, I'm sorry. Right. People reflect if they've gone on and lived a life that has allowed them to be exposed to people of different backgrounds, what they missed out on because they stayed in the kind of norm of race and ethnic relations being, separate and the judgment and the cutting off of relationship. And I would even say of heritage. So I work with a lot of white students, and they're like, well, I'm just white. I'm just normal. That's just who I am. Mm-hmm. But they don't have any depth of understanding about their history and about their heritage. And that's what the creation of whiteness has done in our country. It has cut people off. If you think about name changes, being cut off from languages, history, heritage, there's a lot of loss.
That's right. And that impacts all of us. So for people of color, what are the ways in which racism has increased the level of trauma, the level of stress and toxicity?
So in the literature, let me just be honest, it took a number of decades for researchers of color to say that racism has a negative effect on people. So it was, I stand on the shoulders of researchers who had to make the case over and over and over again to prove that racism has negative effects. And so I honor them because I can now say, all right, we know that it has negative effects. Not that I don't have to continue to say that, but we know that now we need to understand the underlying mechanisms for whom and when and where and what makes it worse for certain people and what can we do to minimize it. And so for people of color, racism can have all sorts of effects, mental health effects in terms of increased anxiety symptoms, increased symptoms of depression, of helplessness. It is now conceptualized in the literature as a trauma because we know that it's a chronic stressor. So some people think about it in the stress and coping framework in terms of having a stressor that you have to cope with and manage over a long period of time. And depending on how you perceive that stressor, it can be perceived as a threat, which can increase the kind of what your body physiologically and psychologically has to bring to bear to deal with it. But there's another body of literature that is conceptualizing it as trauma. And they're calling it race-based trauma.
Race-based trauma.
And they just last year came out with a measure of race-based traumatic stress, Carter, who's at the University of Columbia, and a measure of how people cope with race-based stress. And so I think it's really important for us to understand that kind of evolution in the research field. It's in a way similar to the DOJ report in that people who were on the ground were saying, this is happening, believe us. And we needed a DOJ report to tell us and affirm that for some people. Similarly, as people of color, we know that racism impacts us. We sometimes don't stop to acknowledge it because we become desensitized because it is such a chronic trauma that you become desensitized to it.
What is the process by which we become free?
So emotional wellness, emotional emancipation, however you want to conceptualize that, and being free, not just socioeconomically and in terms of education, but emotionally, means being willing to acknowledge the lies that have been told about us as a people. So they're actually, the Community Health Network and the Association of Black Psychologists have a website, defythelie.org.
Okay.
And it encourages people to acknowledge the ways in which we might have been fed lies about ourselves and ways that we've internalized that, and to understand our humanity. Because we might say, oh, well, we don't dehumanize ourselves or each other. We might, well, that's about what other people do to us. But in reality, if it's like smog in the air, we can't help but breathe it in. And so to be fully well, we have to acknowledge what we have been told about ourselves and what we've internalized and start to unpack that.
Kira, I think about legacy, and one of my main concerns is the impact of the smog on our children. They come into the world seeing the humanity first. I mean, we can learn a lot from them because basically we undo all the goodness through these types of systems. Can you give some practical advice as we close on steps that any individual could take, whether in St. Louis or around the world, to begin to defy the lie?
So I think one step that we often take for granted is to talk about it.
Okay.
Right? So we can't be scared to talk to our children and each other about race, about racism, about the hurts that it creates, and then also racial identity. So how we conceptualize race is part of our identity, and to understand that there isn't just one monolithic racial identity. And we actually know from the psychological research that you don't have to be nationalist, we must build our own, or assimilationist, we should connect with mainstream, that you actually can be well across all of those identities as long as you have a strong sense of self and you are able to unpack the negative messages that you've received and you have strong social support. So I think people have to be willing to talk about the issue.
Absolutely. Anything in closing that you want to say to St. Louis?
So I think in terms of a call to action for St. Louis, we have to be willing to honor each other and see the humanity in each other. And even though it might be uncomfortable, be willing to lean into that discomfort, because to move forward, we have to be able to see humanity in others and connect again.
Dr. Banks, thank you for joining us today. and for all of the great work that you continue to do in St. Louis and beyond. And thank you everyone for listening to another episode of Alive and Well STL.
Alive and Well STL.
We are grateful for your gift of time to this conversation. We encourage you to stay involved and get involved.
If you, your family, or your organization is interested in talking about how we better the well-being of the region, sign up for more information, join the conversation, log on to aliveandwellstl.com, and let's build a plan on how we can work together and improve our overall health and become alive and well. The Regional Health Commission with Chief Executive Officer Robert Friend Jr. committed to providing a detailed review of change over the past decade and 14 leading health indicators for the city and county of St. Louis. The first decade review of health status report, an update to building a healthier St. Louis. Discover the narrative, the data, and celebrate the progress already made to improve healthcare access and reduce health disparities in our region. Learn more at stlrhc.org. Alive and Well STL is another positive production of RareGem Productions. Thanks for listening.